This video will show you how to replace the inner tie rod end on a Chrysler Town Country. This is part of the front steering and suspension, located behind your front wheel. A quick note about doing this job, you will need an alignment once we're done. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. Now the first thing we have to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. Once you've done that, remove all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts so we can get the wheel off of here. Now that we have the wheel out of the way, we can have a look along this area. This is where we can see our tie rod ends and our power steering rack bellows boot. We'll start the removal process in the middle of the outer tie rod end and the inner tie rod end. You're going to find a 22mm jam nut. You can either use a wrench or you can use some long pliers, whatever works best for you. We're going to be turning this clockwise. Once you have movement from there, let's continue on towards the outer tie rod end. Now, as we can see, the outer tie rod end makes its way through our steering knuckle. Up along the top area here is an 18mm mounting nut. Let's go ahead and remove that. We'll give it a quick inspection and start it back on just a couple threads. There's that. We'll use some penetrant in this area. Now, if you do happen to have a tie rod end stud puller, you can use that. Most people don't. You can carefully use a hammer. If you were using a hammer, we want to lightly tap along the steering knuckle, causing vibration. This should drop down. That's what the nut is for, preventing it from falling and potentially hurting us. Now, at this point, we can remove that mounting nut. Quick inspection. We'll set that aside. Now at this point, we can start unscrewing the outer tie rod end counterclockwise. While doing so, count the amount of threads it takes to remove it. 1, 2, and so on. Your results may vary. Just take note. My count was 22. Your results may vary, as I mentioned. A quick inspection will set it aside. Now that we have the outer tie rod end out of the way, we're going to fully remove our jam nut. Now you may find it's stuck on the inner tie rod end. If that's the case, use some locking pliers to prevent the inner tie rod end from spinning and your 22mm to fully remove that nut. A quick inspection of that will set it aside. Let's remove our locking pliers. Now it's time to start removing our power steering rack bellows boot. We'll start with the outer clamp. Now the clamp on this is a squeezable clamp, so I'm going to be using long nose pliers to grab onto my 3 ears, and I should be able to slide this out of place. Set that aside. Let's move to the inner clamp next. This is what attaches the bellows boot to the power steering rack. Now for the inboard clamp, we're going to be using a long pry bar. If you were to look deep inside this area, you're going to be able to find that you have a small tab, which is part of the single-time use clamp. We need to rest our pry bar against it, and then we'll be using a hammer to break it free. Just reach in here, you can start removing that boot. There's our single-time use clamp. That's the ear that I hit up against right there. Let's take hold of that power steering rack bellows boot, give it a twist, and pull it out and away. Now this is common. If you find that it's stuck in place, it's more than likely due to the outboard side. Use a small pick and some lubricant if necessary. A quick inspection will set this aside. Now we can start removing the inner tie rod end from the power steering rack. Now as we look deep in this area, we can see where we have our ball and socket, which is part of the inner tie rod end. We need to take hold of that and turn it counterclockwise, removing it from the power steering rack. You can use an inner tie rod end tool. These come in all different shapes and sizes. This is the type that I have, so I'm just going to go around that ball and socket. I'll make sure it's nice and tight. We'll be turning it counterclockwise to unscrew the inner tie rod end. tool in here. This is broken free. I'll remove my tool. Let's just start unscrewing that from the power steering rack. There it is, friend. Prior to installation of any brand new part, let's make sure we clean and inspect the mounting area. Now, as far as the power steering rack is concerned, the first thing we want to look at is it leaking fluid? If it's leaking fluid deep inside that area, it means that the rack is bad and you're going to want to service that. Ours looks good, so I'm just going to give this a quick wipe, removing as much grease or miscellaneous debris from the area as possible. Now it's time to install the brand new inner tie rod end. We're going to take the threaded portion and screw it into our power steering rack. Once we have it bottomed out by hand, we'll be using the inner tie rod end tool to make sure it's secure. We're not using any type of thread locker on this. When tightening the inner tie rod end, essentially once it's bottomed out, we only want to go a tiny bit further. Keep in mind, you do not want to over tighten this and cause damage to your power steering rack. Right there is bottomed out. Let's remove our tool. Now, in with the inner tie rod end, it came with a packet of lubricant. Lubricate the entire ball and socket area on this area of the inner tie rod end, but save a little bit of that lubricant for along this area here. This is where the bellows boot would sit, and that's going to help the alignment professional in the end. We use a glove finger. We can spread this around. Grease here. Gloved finger, work that around as well. Okay, let's prepare to install our bellows boot. As far as the installation of this, we need to make sure this area goes over our power steering rack. So we're going to come in over our inner tie rod end all the way to the power steering rack. Once we have it in the proper placement, we'll be using a wire tie to hold it securely. Now it's time for our wire tie. I'm just going to form a quick circle but leave it loose. We'll slide it all the way down the bellows boot to the mounting point where it holds the bellows boot to that power steering rack, and then of course make sure it's nice and tight. I can see that I'm all the way down at the far end there near the power steering rack. We'll just make sure we're in the proper placement, and like I said, just make sure it's nice and tight. I'm in the proper placement. I'm just going to use my pliers here. We'll just roll this, taking up any slack. Now it looks as though I have it in the proper placement, so I'm just going to make sure it's nice and tight, and then of course I'll trim off any excess. Let's make our way to the outer mounting point next. Now it's time for our outer clamp. I'm going to be using my squeezable clamp since it was still in good usable order. We just want to make sure that that's properly seated on the boot. This looks good. The next thing I like to do is add some anti-seize on the threaded area of the inner tie rod end where my jam nut will sit. Let's install our jam nut. Now we can prepare to install our outer tie rod end. Now when we go to install the outer tie rod end, we want to get it threaded on. Once we have it started on, continue on by installing it the same amount of turns it took to remove it. 1, 2, and so on. Now as I mentioned before, we want to install this the same amount of turns as it took to remove it. Now that we have that, the same amount of turns as it took to remove it, let's just go ahead and bottom out that jam nut against the outer so it doesn't spin. We'll take the outer and bring it up into the steering knuckle. Let's take that and we'll get it in position into our steering knuckle. Now I did replace my outer tie rod end. This outer tie rod end clearly has a castle nut. The torque for this will be 53 foot-pounds. At this point, we're going to install a locking cotter pin. We need to pay attention to the slots on the mounting nut in comparison to the port on the stud of the outer tie rod end. They need to be aligned. If it's not properly aligned, continue tightening the nut until the very next slot is. We'll make sure we peen that over so there's no way this nut can loosen up on us while we're driving down the road. Let's make our way back to the jam nut. To tighten the jam nut, we're turning it counterclockwise, bringing it towards the outer tie rod end. Now we'll just make sure everything's nice and straight. One last quick inspection in this area, and we can prepare to reinstall our wheel. One last quick inspection while we're still in this area, and we can reinstall our wheel. Now once you have your wheel in place, start on all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts. Bottom them out in a crisscross manner. Get the wheel back on the ground and torque each of those lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. Now I have the wheel safely on the ground. Let's go ahead and torque those lug nuts to that 100 foot-pounds as I mentioned. Torqued. Okay friend, we finished our installation. Now the next thing you have to do is go ahead and take your vehicle for a road test, listen for any odd noises, and get yourself in alignment. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.